We on Fire Sports Podcast, The Spot, season number 4, episode number 42. And yeah, man, appreciate you guys' ear. We on Fire Sports Podcast, The Spot, providing high fire takes and analysis across the sporting landscape. And if you're first time listening, I appreciate your ear. If you're OG of the show, man, I appreciate the check-in. And yeah, man, we had one of the favorite sports times of the year. Happy April to you guys, as man, we mosey on along in the month of April. It's a lot of big things going on across the sporting landscape. And the NBA playoffs is here. Yeah, the playoffs is finally here, man. The long 82-game regular season is over in the NBA. As we got coming up tomorrow, man, the play-in games of the NBA leading into the playoffs kicking off later on this week. It's playoff teams who've qualified for the playoffs and not the playoffs. The play-in, they get that week off, much needed for a bunch of teams across the NBA as the Eastern and Western Conference is ready to kick it off. So you know we gonna get into that. Also, too, first, congratulations, man, to Rory McIlroy, man, winning the Masters tournament down there in Augusta. It's his first green jacket of his career. He's one of the most polarizing golfers in all of golf and completes the Grand Slam as he's won the other major tournaments, but came up big time in the Masters over the weekend, man, winning in that playoff, man, down there in Augusta. And I'm not going to front, man. The Masters, for me, is one of those tournaments, man. It's one of my bucket list items, man, being not too far from where I'm located at, a couple hours south of Atlanta, down there in Augusta. You know, I had a couple friends that actually went to the Masters this year. It's their first time going to the Masters, man. And they've been giving me a lot of rave reviews, you know, down there in Augusta, man, to check out the whole golfing landscape. So first and foremost, man, congratulations to Rory McIlroy, man, winning his first Masters tournament in epic fashion, in playoff fashion, man, down there in Augusta. Also, too, man, as we got the playoffs jumping off, you know I'm going to get into my award winners, man, my award winners of the NBA season. These people that I feel that, you know, has definitely put their etch into NBA history, winning the prestigious awards. I'm going to give you my take on the award winners. Also, we got breaking news in the NBA as well, man. We got the Phoenix Suns, man, moving on from Coach Bud, man. Coach Budenholzer, you know, he gets the axe down there in Phoenix. You know, I knew this was coming. You know, if you're OG of the show, you might have heard last couple episodes ago. You know, I mentioned that it's time for the Phoenix Suns to move on from Coach Bud. They finally made that decision today. That's breaking news. Also breaking news down there in New Orleans, man, is the New Orleans Pelicans. They move on from GM David Griffin. Showed David Griffin the axe. The Pelicans, man, with the 4th worst record in the NBA this season. We all know the whole situation with Zion Williamson, man, being injured and out basically most of the season. And I saw this move coming as well, as New Orleans has been a straight train wreck. So we're going to get into that. Also, in Philadelphia, you know, word on the street is that the Philadelphia 76ers is bringing back Daryl Morey, the GM of the Philadelphia 76ers, as well as Nick Nurse. Not sure how I feel about that, you know, especially for me. I think that Nick Nurse, you know, won the NBA championship up in Toronto. You know, he's a good coach to me. You know, he's a coach that, you know, got his wheels going in the G League, man, and built himself up as a viable NBA coach. You know, I feel that the Sixers, you know, they're in a tough situation, man, with Joel Embiid being out, you know, most of this season. You know, you obviously, you know, had a situation with PG Paul George, who got shut down towards the end of the season. It's been a straight train wreck for Philadelphia as they don't make the playoffs as well. So we're going to get into that. Also, too, shout out to Chris Paul, man, out here, man. Chris Paul, man, in his 20th season in the NBA, played all 82 games. You know, I know it's been a big thing across the NBA, man, the players sitting out, you know, for having, you know, basically a hangnail or something like that and not, you know, bringing their best forth effort of being available every day. But I got to send a shout out, man, to Chris Paul. You know, he changed his diet over to a vegan diet, man, and, you know, down there in San Antonio with the Spurs. He's definitely an OG for that organization, man, being available for all 82 games in his 20th season is definitely something to tip the cap at. So shout out, say, to Chris Paul. And also, too, in this episode, I'm going to talk about ESPN. Yeah, we're going to talk about ESPN, man. There's a lot of people, have various opinions about just the coverage of ESPN. Me being one of them, man. I've been very critical of ESPN just with their coverage overall, especially on the NBA tip. The NFL coverage, is great with ESPN. I enjoy the NFL coverage. Right now, we got the NFL draft coming up. Mel Kiper doing this thing, man. He in full bloom. So I appreciate that part. Shout out to Louis Riddick. He's done a great job at ESPN as well. So kudos to those gentlemen. I think on the football coverage of ESPN, they've been pristine. So I have no complaints. But on the basketball coverage, man, I got a bone to pick with ESPN and just their coverage across the NBA. And I also, too, speaking of the NFL tip and coverage on ESPN, I got a little tidbit out there, man. I want to share with you guys, man. Word on the street coming down the pipeline that ESPN is presently in talks with the NFL Network to publish or to try to get say their publishing entities for their media and just their shows and all that. So I'm gonna get into that as well. But let's talk about this NBA, man. As right now, man, we had some amazing games over the weekend. Just in playoff scenarios, especially in the Western Conference. The Eastern Conference was pretty much set as we got into the weekend. But things heated up in the Western Conference as we had a bunch of showdown games that made, sense as far as what teams would be seated at in the Western Conference. The most notable game was the Los Angeles Clippers taking on the Golden State Warriors. And, man, was that a good game. Oh, man, was that a classic game, man. Between the Clippers and the Warriors. The Warriors, they win the game. They lock in that 6th seed, avoid the whole play-in situation. They would have took on the Los Angeles Lakers in round number 1 of the NBA playoffs. And that's just epic, just to say the least, with LeBron James and Luka Doncic taking on Steph Curry and, JB, Jimmy Butler, and Draymond Green. That would have been must-see television. But the Warriors came up short, man. And this game went into overtime, man, and we saw a classic Kawhi Leonard and James Harden, both those gentlemen putting up the 30 pieces each. On the other side, Steph Curry as well as Jimmy Butler, they put up the 30 piece each as well. Game came down to the end. It was a much winnable game for both teams. Warriors was obviously able to come back in that game, man, down by 7 points in the fourth quarter. And Draymond Green, man, jagging the layup in the overtime period, man, cost the Warriors. And the Warriors, man, they go into now another epic play-in situation. Play-in is just a live and die NCAA tournament type of feel. Some teams have 2 opportunities to get into the playoffs, just on that whole slate. And, those will be jumping off as early as tomorrow with the play-in game situation. But I want to talk about just a little bit about just both these teams, the Golden State Warriors and the Los Angeles Clippers. Because most people feel that both these teams have a punch of chance at getting out of the West. I do think that Golden State did themselves no favor by losing this game, falling into the play-in, man. Because as I mentioned a little bit earlier, man, it's all ball, man. Once you get into the play-in, and for the Golden State Warriors, they come right back on Tuesday. This game be played on Tuesday, man, on TNT, 7:30 Eastern time, between the Memphis Grizzlies and the Golden State Warriors. This game will be played out in San Francisco, and these are 2 polarizing teams in the West. I mean, you look at it a couple months ago, man, Memphis Grizzlies looks like they was in a top 4 position. They actually made my NBA Big 5 list. Things was looking kind of good. Jaren Jackson Jr. was kind of back into the fold after getting nicked up a little bit with injuries. Desmond Bane, he's done an outstanding job for the Memphis Grizzlies all season long. Obviously, he got John Morant in this whole situation. And what Jay-Z say, man, it was all good just a week ago. The Memphis Grizzlies fired Taylor Jenkins. They moved on from him. That was a big-time epic move for their whole organization. Taylor Jenkins had been there for 6 seasons. So they switched gears on the coaching. We got John Morant, just the whole gun gesture situation. Here we go again. And this team fell all the way back into the 8th seed, into the play-in, and they will take on the Golden State Warriors. The Warriors, without all the theatrics, they were in a similar situation where they got hot once they got the acquisition of Jimmy Butler. This team has been playing some outstanding basketball once Jimmy Butler got there. I was very critical of Jimmy Butler with the whole situation with Miami and him and Pat Riley. But ever since he's been in Golden State, he's been on his best behavior. You ain't hearing nothing from Jimmy Butler other than what he's been producing on the court. And I felt like the Warriors, they've been trending up for me. And I can't front, they've been trending up for me. If we had the same conversation 3 months ago, I thought they was dead in the water. But that trade, gave them a jolt of life. And right now, just with the struggles they had early part of the season, they in the playing situation. And this game could be up for grabs. I mean, we've seen a couple years ago the Memphis Grizzlies take on the same Golden State Warriors in a playing situation, and they sent the Golden State Warriors home. The season was over just like that. And so it's going to be a situation, man. It's going to be a situation. Now, both these teams, they have the opportunity to lose a game or lose this game and still be alive virtually, meaning that the loser of this game will play on Friday on ESPN versus the winner of the 9-10 game. And the 9-10 game features the Sacramento Kings coming in as the 9th seed against the Dallas Mavericks. Dallas Mavericks, they've had their whole soap opera situation with trading Luka Doncic to the Los Angeles Lakers for Anthony Davis. Anthony Davis get there, first day on the job, man, get injured. And, the Dallas Mavericks have been trying to swim upstream ever since then. This is a team, obviously, we know Kyrie Irving went out for the season earlier this year. And this is a team I don't really have a lot of confidence in, man. I think next season they may be geared up to make a potential run in the Western Conference. But I think that they just rolling downhill, man, going into the play-in situation. The Sacramento Kings, they got a lot of firepower, man. You got Zach LaVine over there, DeMar DeRozan over there. This is a team that's been kind of under the radar. Nobody's really talked about them all season long. And they got an opportunity to win this game, man, coming up on Wednesday. Try to get themselves an inch closer potentially to getting into the playoffs. Whoever, wins, getting out of that particular seed will play will play the Oklahoma City Thunder or the Houston Rockets. Just depends on who wins and where. And so virtually both of these teams, or could be all four of these teams that's in the play-in, man, for the Western Conference, could be an early exit. I think the Golden State Warriors got the best chance as a play-in team to be able to knock one of them first one or two seeds off in the Western Conference, whether it be Oklahoma City, whether it be the Houston Rockets. And so we'll see, man. We'll see. I think that Golden State, though, will take on the Houston Rockets pretty much. If they're able to get out of the play-in situation, they definitely got a chance to win that series. And so we'll see what it do, man, in the West. In the East, we got the whole playing situation, man, between the Atlanta Hawks and Orlando Magic. They play on Tuesday as well, 7:30 on TNT. And, both these teams, man, the Orlando Magic, I had high hopes for them coming into the season. And I would say probably the first month of the season, they was looking like they was on P. But then we had Paolo Banchero get injured. And Jamal Mosley, man, the head coach of the Orlando Magic, he's just been trying to have this team hold water all season long. They fell into the 7th seed, and they got a nice little matchup against the Atlanta Hawks as these two teams played, was that 2 days ago? So the Hawks, man, for me, they've been in a tough situation. They had an injury, big-time injury this season, man, having Jalen Johnson go out. He went out for the rest of the year. I thought that kind of hamstringed the Atlanta Hawks. Obviously, Trae Young, man, he's had some big playoff games in his career. And so I don't expect a lot out of both of these two teams, even though ironically they're the higher seeded teams in the play-in in the Eastern Conference. And then we got on Wednesday, we got my Chicago Bulls taking on the Miami Heat. These two teams played less than a week or so ago in an epic game, epic finish for the Chicago Bulls, man. Seems like the Bulls been playing some hot basketball, man, last, month of the season. Kobe White winning NBA Player of the Month. This team after that Zach LaVine trade has been hotter than a firecracker, man. I got to send a shout out to the Bulls because I've been critical of the Bulls, man, because I think that the Bulls, we live in the play-in. But I think that this is the hottest Bulls team that we've seen coming into a play-in situation over the last couple of years for them. They take on the Miami Heat. Heat obviously moved on from Jimmy Butler, as I mentioned a little bit earlier. They've been kind of on the skids, but finally kind of got themselves a little bit corrected. So we'll see what Bam Adebayo and Tyler Hero do for the Miami Heat taking on the Bulls on Wednesday. And obviously we know the loser of this particular game, the loser of the 7 and 8 game, which will be Orlando versus Atlanta, will have another chance to move themselves on into the play-in, into potentially the playoffs. And obviously that 9-10 game between Miami and the Bulls is a winner-take-all situation. You lose and your season is basically over. So that's what we're looking at, man, in the NBA, man. And, coming up, man, I'll give a nice little preview to the teams that have made it into the playoff situation, what I expect out of them, man, what we see in this first round preview of the NBA playoff slate. So first and foremost, man, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, man, I appreciate all the love and the feedback. I appreciate your ear. We on Fire Sports Podcast. Welcome back. And before we get into the playoff slate in the NBA, right now, the NBA is the best time of the season for them as we have, the college situation over with. The NCAA tournament has concluded. You got the Masters that just concluded. You got the NFL draft in the NFL in the off season coming up with the NFL draft coming up towards the end of the month. And so right now, NBA, they're king of the sporting landscape right now. Baseball in the first couple of weeks of their season. And so before I get into just what I feel across the NBA matchups in the playoffs in the Eastern Conference as well as the Western Conference, we going to get into teams that had high expectations but fell straight off. And teams that we will not see and players we will not see during these NBA playoffs coming up. And the first order of business is the whole situation out there in Phoenix. As, word came down today, man, the Phoenix Suns moved on from Coach Mike Budenholzer. This is something that if you're OG of the show, man, the last couple of episodes ago, I mentioned that I thought that Coach Bud was going to be on the outs in Phoenix. Watching this team very, very closely, they just not listening to Coach Bud. I just think he's lost his umph. We seen that situation, man, in Milwaukee when the Milwaukee Bucks moved on from him after winning the NBA championship up there in Milwaukee. And I just saw it. The team just didn't play with no motivation. They had an outside puncher's chance of getting to the play-in, man, the last, say, 4 weeks of the season. This team went on an 8-game skid to close out the year. They played with no fight at all. And I just think that they're just not motivated by this guy. Now, some of that is on the players. Obviously, when you got Devin Booker and Bradley Beal and Kevin Durant, three, quote-unquote, potential future Hall of Famers, is that some of that goes on the players. But I just think that Coach Bud, he just don't move the needle. And so I knew his head was going to be on the guillotine. I seen that coming. I wouldn't be surprised if James Jones, the general manager of the Phoenix Suns, and if he's next on that guillotine. And Robert, I'm sorry, not Robert, but Matt Ishbia, who purchased the team for Robert Sarver, the former owner of the Phoenix Suns. He came in and tried to make some lightning rod moves. They made the big time trade with the Brooklyn Nets with Kevin Durant to bring him over to Phoenix. They moved on from Cam Johnson and Mikal Bridges within that deal. They traded a bunch of first round picks in that deal back out to Brooklyn, just in regards. And they just took a nice little swing. And I think that, to me, not only is this a disaster for Phoenix, but it just shows that the blueprint has changed in the NBA. This whole Big Three thing, I just think that Phoenix was the last team to fall on the Big Three sword. It just does not work anymore, especially with the finances of the NBA, with the apron and with the luxury taxes in the NBA, is that Adam Silver in the league, they're trying to push away, man, from the Big Three era. And, Phoenix was the last team to really try to matriculate that with their organization. And it was a crash and burn. I mean, if you don't have a balanced team, is that at the end of the day, you're going to struggle, especially if any one of those Big Three dudes are out for any, stint of time. You're going to be in a tough situation. And we saw it. Phoenix really don't have a big man. They really don't have any, inside fortitude or toughness. Nurkic tried to, make a move with Phoenix and try to be that guy. But him and Coach Bud got into it, and he was out of the rotation towards the end of the year. So that was a crash and burn. They never really had a point guard situation out in Phoenix. You had Devin Booker basically running the whole show from the point guard situation. That was a crash and burn because he's really a two guard and a scorer. And so I think that for me, Phoenix, when they made the moves, this team got to the NBA Finals, during the whole COVID situation. That wasn't that long ago. And just the dynamic of the team, changed. They traded DeAndre Ayton to the Portland Trailblazers. And I thought that was a mistake. I just don't think that you trade big men who are under the age of 25, who has a defensive ability and is able to give you some offense. Those guys are like unicorns in the NBA nowadays, man. It's just very few of them in the league overall. So you trade a major asset, a guy that you drafted number 1 overall from the University of Arizona, in the NBA draft a few years back. And I just think that Phoenix, man, they just lost the proper steps in the proper way to build an organization and understand that in the Western Conference is just a lot of talent. Sometimes teams make moves like the Los Angeles Lakers did to bring in Luka Doncic. And at the end of the day, once you made that decision to bring them 3 guys in there, you couldn't make any ancillary moves outside of that. You couldn't make any personnel moves outside of that. And so right now you're stuck. This team has the highest payroll in NBA history right now in Phoenix. And Wouldn't be surprised. We all know the elephant in the room. I think that Kevin Durant will find a new home sometime this summer. I think the Phoenix Suns are going to trade him to the highest bidder, try to get themselves out of cap hell. Bradley Beal, he has a no trade clause, so that's a whole situation. I do think that the Phoenix Suns do maintain and stay with Devin Booker, so we'll see what the Phoenix Suns and their whole situation do moving forward. And another team that was a crash and burn this year was the Philadelphia 76ers. They brought in Paul George from the Los Angeles Clippers, broke him off with a max deal, big bag of money for him, brought him over to Philadelphia. You had Joel Embiid. They had just extended him over the summer, coming off the Olympic situation. And both those guys was nowhere to be found towards the end of the year. Both of them was on the injury men. And to me, I thought that the main culprit for that whole situation in Philadelphia is Daryl Morey. I just don't think this guy's just worth the baggage. We seen the whole situation with Daryl Morey down in Houston with James Harden. He put, some decent teams, together down there in Houston. Obviously, the whole Chris Paul experiment and Russell Westbrook experiment, but they fell up short. And then we get to Philadelphia. You had a guy in Elton Brand who was the general manager at the time. You downgraded him. He's still in the organization. And Philadelphia's had a whole litmus of just big time players, whether it's Ben Simmons or Tobias Harris or Jimmy Butler, and it just doesn't work. And so I just think that Daryl Morey, to me, he should have been fired. I thought that they should have retained Nick Nurse, which they came out and said they're going to retain both of them. I think that Nick Nurse is still a good coach, but I just think that Daryl Morey, to me, man, he's just overrated. This guy's never won an NBA championship as a general manager. So at the end of the day, how many at-bats this guy's going to get for Philadelphia to try to get this team at least at a contender status in the Eastern Conference, man. So Philadelphia, they was a train wreck this year. They was another team that, a lot of people felt like they had a puncher's chance at potentially, getting to an NBA Finals and challenging Boston in the Eastern Conference. But they'll be sitting at home like everybody else watching the NBA playoffs as well. And then my third team that, to me, was a crash and burn. Now, this team, they didn't have, say, the same expectations of the other two teams that I just mentioned. But they had a talented team at the beginning of the year. And I'm talking about the New Orleans Pelicans. New Orleans, they just came out today, said that they're going to they're firing David Griffin, the general manager of the New Orleans Pelicans. A lot of people remember David Griffin when he was the general manager of the Cleveland Cavaliers, when Kyrie Irving and LeBron James won an NBA championship up in Cleveland. And his first move was to trade Anthony Davis. And to me, I just thought that was a situation where they got Brandon Ingram, they got Lonzo Ball in that deal. As you guys know, that both those guys are no longer in New Orleans as Brandon Ingram is in Toronto, which they traded him to Toronto because they didn't want to pay Brandon Ingram. They didn't want to re-up him. Lonzo Ball obviously moved on to my Chicago Bulls. And so you really have nothing to speak of in that whole situation with Anthony Davis. Also, too, you got a situation with Zion Williamson. Now, we've been hearing more stuff off the court with Zion Williamson than we have on the court, with the various injuries, the various personal situations that he's going through off the court. And I was one to say it. I said this at the beginning of the year, that I thought that the New Orleans Pelicans, it was in their best interest to try to trade Zion Williamson, get as much as you can for this guy, and try to move the organization forward, because with him there, you're not going nowhere. This team finished with the 4th worst record in the NBA this season. I thought that, David Griffin, I thought it was smart for New Orleans Pelicans to move on from him. I think the head coach, Willie Green, I think he'll be next to be moved on from down there in New Orleans. And I just think that the third piece of that is that you got to trade Zion Williamson, man, because at the end of the day, his value is going down in the tanks because he's just a guy that is not available. And you might as well cash in on him on the trade market to see if you can get some guys down there that be able to move your organization forward. So that's my take, man, on the three teams that, to me, they had some pretty high expectations coming into the NBA season, but they fell off like a bad habit, and they'll be watching, the NBA playoffs just like everybody else coming up in the next week or so. So coming up, man, we're going to get into just the matchups that we know going to jump off in the NBA playoffs as we're waiting for the play-in situation to go ahead and conclude. Also, too, just going to kick game, man, breaking news or news that I've heard across the ESPN landscape and a few power moves that they're going to do moving forward potentially. So we'll see what it do. And also, too, finally, I'm going to hit you guys with my MVP winner of the NBA, as well as Coach of the Year and Rookie of the Year in the NBA, man. So first and foremost, I appreciate all the love and the feedback. I appreciate your ear. We on Fire Sports Podcast, the spot. Welcome back. And before we get out of here, man, we're just going to handle a few little things that I came across the sports desk here at We on Fire Sports Podcast, the spot. First order of news, man, word on the street is, man, that ESPN, they're in talks with the National Football League to buy the National Football League's media imprint. We all know that the NFL, they have the NFL Network and just the various shows they have over there. You know, I dabble, back and forth with just some of their shows over there on the NFL Network. But they don't have the same luster to me as, some of the shows even on Fox or CBS Sports as well as ESPN. And word on the street is that they're in conversations, man, for the ESPN to buy that imprint for $2 billion over there for the National Football League. As well as what I'm hearing is that the National Football League is interested in buying a stake or a majority stake potentially in ESPN overall as a network. That's going to be a whole situation. I think ESPN, they went through their whole thing, layoffs, the whole big layoff situation that happened, a little bit over almost close to about 2 years ago. And just the shifting of the shows, them bringing over Pat McAfee. We got, just various hosts that came over, say, to ESPN since that whole layoff situation and just new talent and new hiring that they're doing. Also, one of their staple shows, Around the Horn, they're going to get canceled coming up next month, be their last little run on ESPN. And so they're going through a lot of changes. There's been a lot of movement across just the media landscape overall with, people with podcasts such as myself. Obviously, people out there with video podcasts. And there's been a lot of, say, movement or ship of just audiences from ESPN. And to me, I got beef with ESPN because I think that the NFL coverage is fine. I don't have a problem with their NFL coverage. But I just think that their NBA coverage is kind of stale. Just with the shows that they have. Now, obviously, Kendrick Perkins, he's been, a big time asset, say, for ESPN, whether you like him or not. To me, he kind of moves the needle with his opinions and so forth. But I just think that some of the coverage of the NBA is just old and tired. I mean, every time you put on an ESPN show, man, they talking about basketball, man. It's just Lakers, and LeBron James. And I'm like, at the end of the day, man, all respect to, Los Angeles Lakers fans. They're one of the most polarizing franchises in all of American sports. I came up, loving the Los Angeles Lakers. In the 1980s, obviously the Showtime Lakers with Magic Johnson and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar and James Worthy, Pat Riley, Byron Scott, just to say the least. So, I respect their fan base because they're a passionate fan base and they've had some historic teams over the years, even going back to the Elgin Baylor and Jerry West days. But at the end of the day, man, it's just that they lack variety, man. It's just like the same old swag, man. It's like going to a restaurant and they just serving the same old food and they're not changing, say, the menu up. So that's my beef with ESPN, man. I just think that their NBA coverage to me is not up to snuff. Obviously we've got, the situation with Countdown, with Stephen A. Smith being on the Countdown show. That added a little say to the show. But, just that NBA Today show and just that whole situation with Malika Andrews and just all what they doing over there, it's just not moving the needle for me. And I'm not hating on them, man. It's just every time I turn their show on or take a look at their show, even on Get Up, the show leading into, say, First Take, it's just all about Lakers. And nobody's really talking about the other teams or the other teams that have had, say, great seasons, such as like the Houston Rockets of the world or the Detroit Pistons of the world, a team that people left for dead last season. And now they're in the playoff situation and Cade Cunningham is probably going to be on one of these all-NBA teams this year. So that's my beef with ESPN, man. It's just sometimes, man, you turn on, say, the product, man, and it's just the same old tired tune, man. So, that's my, speaking my piece, man, just on that whole situation. But we gonna get into my NBA awards, man, before we preview just a little bit of the NBA playoffs coming up with the teams that we all know that's in the playoffs and not say in the play-in. And I'm going to start at the top, man. I'm going to start at the top. And, there's been a lot of back and forth as far as who's going to win the MVP in the NBA this year between Shai Gilgeous-Alexander and Nikola Jokic, the Joker out there in Denver. And for me, it was a tight race. It was a tight race for me going into probably the final, say, 3 weeks to month of the season. I thought that both these guys had clearly separated themselves from everybody else. I can't forget about the other players, though, that deserve, kudos, such as Jason Tatum with the Boston Celtics. To me, he's having his best statistical season of his career out there in Boston. But Boston, they're a well-oiled machine. And so I think some of that takes the shine off of Jason Tatum and so forth. Can't forget about the season Donovan Mitchell has had out in Cleveland. This is a team with the number one seed, over 60-plus wins. They've had an outstanding year. He's not had, say, what you call a jump-out statistical season. But I just think that when you watch Cleveland play, he's the ultimate closer for this ball club, man, and they're playing some good basketball up there in Cleveland. So you can't forget about those two gentlemen. But for me, I got Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, man, bringing in the MVP award, man. This guy averaging 33 points a clip. The Oklahoma City Thunder is locked in the number one seed in the Western Conference, over 60-plus wins, say, this year. And they've done an outstanding job. Mark Daigneault, the head coach of the Oklahoma City Thunder, he's got this young team playing well, especially on the defensive end. They rank number one in all major defensive categories. But just how smooth Shai Gilgeous-Alexander is, man, SGA, man. This guy's smooth as the other side of the pillow, averaging 33 a clip. Last year he finished second in the MVP award, and this year, man, I got him finally bringing that MVP award home this year, man. We'll see what Oklahoma City Thunder do during the NBA playoffs. Speaking of, I got my coach of the year, and this one to me was very, very difficult. Because we got Mark Daigneault out there in Oklahoma City. He's done an outstanding job with that young team. We got Ime Udoka down there in Houston. The Houston Rockets, locking in the 2 seed. They done an outstanding job with that ball club. But I got to give it, man, to my man J.B. Bickerstaff, man, for the Detroit Pistons. Detroit, man, they was a running joke last year, man. This team was going nowhere fast. They had Monty Williams in the fold. That was a whole situation. They paid him a whole huge big bag of money. And I thought that it was in their best interest to move on from Monty Williams. I called that straight out. I thought it was time for them to move on from Monty Williams. So they made that decision. Brought in J.B. Bickerstaff, who had just got fired from the Cleveland Cavaliers, by the way, a team that won 50-plus games last year and got into the playoffs. The job JB has done, man, with this team, man, and Cade Cunningham has ratcheted up. He's done a great job this year. And this team plays with a toughness. Obviously they got the biggest bullet on the block with Isaiah Stewart. And so this team, man, we'll see what they do in the playoffs, man. They match up with the Knicks coming up in the playoffs. That's going to be an epic first-round playoff matchup, man. But, yeah, I got J.B. Bickerstaff winning the NBA Coach of the Year. He's done an outstanding job with Detroit, taking this team from a dumpster fire to getting this team into the playoffs. And so we'll see what Detroit do moving forward, say, this year. And also, my last award that I'm going to give out is going to be the Rookie of the Year award. Now, this year, we didn't have, say, the Victor Wembanyama's or the generational talent. And I felt, that was, at the top of the NBA draft, say, this year. And there was a lot of guys that was worthy. My people in Chicago definitely want me to shout out Brucelis. Matas has had a great season for the Bulls, man. Just high hopes. He's the number 11 pick in the NBA draft, man. I thought the Bulls got a steal in that situation. So, he's definitely, worthy of winning the Rookie of the Year award. But I'm going to give the Rookie of the Year, man, to Stephon Castle, man, of the San Antonio Spurs. I just think the young man has been consistent all year. He's been putting up some decent numbers all year. Ironically, I had an opportunity to watch this young man play in high school, man. He's from the outside the Atlanta, Georgia area. He was a big-time high school player, man, down here in Georgia. Obviously, won a national championship at the University of Connecticut. And I think the sky's the limit for San Antonio next year. Obviously, Victor Wembanyama will be back. So we'll see what they do next year, man. They're a young team. And so I got Stephon Castle winning that Rookie of the Year award, say, this year. And finally, man, before we get out of here, man, we got the NBA playoffs, man, coming up, say, this weekend. We got the Nuggets jumping off with the Clippers. We got the Lakers matched up with the Timberwolves. Obviously, the Thunder and the Rockets are waiting on for that play-in situation to conclude. Also, too, on the east side of the Eastern Conference, we got the Cleveland Cavaliers and the Boston Celtics, the first 1 and 2 seeds, and they're waiting for the play-in situations to be over with. Also, we got the Indiana Pacers and the Milwaukee Bucks locking horns in that 4-5 matchup. And also, too, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, we got the Knicks and the Detroit Pistons locking up. Also in that 3-6 matchup. So, we're going to get into, my whole breakdown of the NBA playoffs, man, and just the matchups, man. We're going to have that coming up, man, towards the end of the week. But first and foremost, man, I appreciate you guys. You can definitely catch me out, man. We on Facebook. We on Fire Sports. Also, too, we on YouTube. We on Fire Sports Podcast. Also, too, we're on Twitter at We On Fire Sports. Don't forget also, too, to check out my pals over there at the Weekly Dog Sports Betting Podcast, Mako and East Lane, Mr. Taylor Street at Firebox 2300. They all over YouTube making big things happen as well. You can also catch me, too, over there on their various little outlets that they have, also with their Hardwire edition. So, first and foremost, man, I hope you guys had a great weekend, man, as we jump off into the sporting landscape this week. We on Fire Sports Podcast, the spot.